Building a church sounds like a construction problem. You find land, you hire a contractor, you file for a permit, you pour a foundation. In Saudi Arabia, that entire process simply does not exist because there was never a form built for anyone to apply on. The basic law of governance names Islam as the only religion the state recognizes, and no ministry, no office, no procedure was ever created to license a church, a temple, or a synagogue anywhere in the country. So the real question was never how much it would cost to build one. It's where an estimated 1.4 to 3.5 million Christians actually go instead, and what that costs them. Start with what a legal church would need, on paper, if the process existed at all. Land in a major Saudi city, comparable to what a mosque compound occupies, would run into the tens of millions of riyals before a single wall goes up. Construction, staffing, a resident clergy visa, security infrastructure, none of it has ever been priced because none of it has ever been permitted to move past the idea stage.
So that number, however large, is fictional. The real acquisition cost lives somewhere else entirely. It lives inside a walled residential compound. Western expatriate compounds in Riyadh and Jeddah rent for roughly 2 to 3 times what an identical apartment costs outside the gate, and a single premium villa can run 120,000 to 350,000 Saudi riyals a year. On paper, that premium buys a pool, a gym, and round-the-clock security. In practice, it buys something the listing never says out loud: a perimeter wall behind which a Sunday gathering in someone's living room is far less likely to draw attention. That's the actual acquisition cost of a church in Saudi Arabia. It's not paid to a contractor. It's paid to a landlord, disguised as rent. Now, who actually controls this, structurally? Ownership of religious infrastructure in Saudi Arabia is entirely centralized. The Ministry of Islamic Affairs funds, staffs, and supervises nearly every mosque in the country, employs the imams directly, and vets every sermon topic. There is no equivalent ministry, no parallel budget line, no licensing office for any other faith. So control over where Christians can gather doesn't sit with Christians at all. It sits with 3 groups who aren't the Saudi state. Employers like Aramco and other multinationals who set the informal tolerance policy inside their own compound walls. Foreign governments, whose embassies sit on soil that's legally outside Saudi jurisdiction entirely.
And the Kingdom of Bahrain, 25 kilometers away, which actually owns and licenses working churches that a huge share of Saudi-based Christians rely on. Whoever holds the real estate holds the religious freedom. None of the people holding it are Saudi Arabia's government. That structure exists because of 2 walls that block any naive attempt to do this the normal way. The first wall is the state monopoly itself. There is no application to reject because there's no office that processes one. The second wall is the law around proselytizing. Spreading a non-Muslim faith is not permitted. Conversion away from Islam is legally classified as apostasy, and apostasy technically carries the death penalty, even though courts haven't carried out that specific sentence in decades. For years, a third wall backed that up directly: the mutawa, the religious police, who could detain people suspected of violating these rules. In 2016, the government stripped them of arrest power entirely, and now they can only report suspected violations to the regular police. That single regulatory change quietly lowered the risk of the entire underground system without changing the underlying law at all. Here's a real case of the system actually working, imperfectly, around those walls.
In Riyadh, Filipino and Indian Catholic communities have built what one recent report called the Church of the Catacombs. House gatherings connected by Zoom to actual parishes in Kerala and Manila, priests appearing on a tablet screen instead of in person, entire masses streamed into a converted living room. It's not a legal workaround, it's an invisible one, made possible by the same connectivity infrastructure every compound already pays for. Since 2018, enforcement against these gatherings has visibly loosened. That year, Saudi state media reported that the religious police had quietly stopped enforcing the ban on Christian gatherings altogether, and a Coptic bishop held mass openly in Riyadh with a formal invitation from the crown prince himself. So where does the actual money move? Not toward a building, toward 5 different layers of cost that all substitute for one. Layer 1, the compound premium, already covered, the single largest line item, running well into 6 figures of rials a year for the households paying it. Layer 2, cross-border worship tourism. 25 kilometers from the eastern province, the King Fahd Causeway connects Saudi Arabia to Bahrain, where actual licensed churches exist. The crossing toll alone runs 35 rials each way as of this year, and a one-way taxi from Al Khobar into Manama runs another 100 to 150 rials. Bahrain's Sacred Heart Church, built in 1939 on land the country's own ruler donated, now serves an estimated 140,000 parishioners, and church records describe large numbers of them crossing that exact causeway specifically for Christmas, New Year, and Easter services, because Saudi Arabia has no churches of its own. Layer 3, the diplomatic access economy. A handful of embassies in Riyadh's diplomatic quarter function as the closest thing the country has to a legal chapel, protected under the Vienna Convention as sovereign foreign soil. Access isn't sold outright, but it's rationed by nationality, by pre-registration, by who happens to know who at which mission. Layer 4, the corporate retention economy. Companies recruiting global talent already know housing eats up something like 35 to 45% of a typical expatriate's monthly budget. On top of that, employers routinely add housing allowances worth 20 to 25% of base salary, hardship pay for the toughest postings, and settling-in bonuses running 60 to 100% of a month's salary. None of it is labeled compensation for having nowhere to worship. All of it functions that way anyway, because a distracted, isolated employee is a flight risk, and relocation consultants will say so plainly. Layer 5, the connectivity economy. Every Zoom mass, every live stream sermon from Kerala, every prayer group chat runs on infrastructure someone is already paying for as an ordinary internet bill, quietly repurposed into the country's most common form of church attendance. None of those 5 layers show up as cost of religion on anyone's spreadsheet. That's what makes them the hidden cost. Not the price tag itself, but the fact that it's never named. Families lose real time and money to a causeway crossing that exists purely because their own country won't build what's 25 kilometers away. Isolated employees leave assignments early, and companies eat the cost of replacing them without anyone writing down why. There's a cost with no invoice at all, the personal legal risk. If a private gathering gets reported, it's not the compound's risk or the employer's, it's the individual's. Uninsurable, unbudgeted, born alone. That risk is not theoretical. In 2010, Saudi police raided a private mass being held in a Riyadh rest house. About 150 Filipino workers were attending. 12 men and the visiting priest were arrested and formally charged with proselytizing. They were released days later, only on guarantees from their sponsors and the Philippine embassy. Nothing about that gathering was different from thousands of others happening quietly across the country that same weekend. The only difference was that this one got reported. That's the entire risk model in one incident. Not what you do, but whether anyone tells. So 2 ways this goes from here. The optimistic version, momentum keeps building the way it has since 2018, when enforcement visibly loosened and a Coptic bishop said Mass in the open for the first time. Backers have floated Neom, or the diplomatic quarter itself, as sites for the country's actual first licensed church, and clergy who've worked the region for decades say they believe it could genuinely happen within their lifetime. The realistic version? This is the same country that let a 2018 headline about a Vatican deal circulate for days before the Vatican itself called it false, and as of now, the underlying fact hasn't moved even slightly. Still 0 churches, still the same compounds, the same causeway, the same tablet screens standing in for a congregation. Either way, here's the actual reframe. Nobody is building a church in Saudi Arabia, and nobody has priced one because that was never the product being sold. The product is discretion. 5 different versions of it, sold by 5 different landlords who aren't Saudi Arabia's government at all, to more than 1 million people paying for it every single week without a single receipt that says what it's actually for.